morning. My name's Bill Davis. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I was in Vietnam in 1968 and in Thailand in 1969. 2 tours of duty in Southeast Asia. On my second tour of duty in Thailand, I was with a project called the Electronic Battlefield, which in 1969 was an early attempt to computerize the war, a lot like the way the war is being computerized now. It was an attempt to do the killing in an automated way. It wasn't totally successful, but it was the forerunner of a lot of projects that later reached fruition, like the automated bombing of El Salvador that was done from Honduras. That was one of the outgrowths of such a project. Here we are 25 years after U.S. withdrawal from the war in Vietnam. And in the interim, some of the things we've come to learn is the concept of the way veterans are upheld, the way veterans are spoken of in this society, the glorification of veterans, and to some degree the glorification of war. But one of the things that I find so strange about this glorification of veterans, glorification of war, is in one breath they talk about the great sacrifices that people have made, and on the other hand they treat the living veterans so poorly. When we came back and talked about post-Vietnam syndrome, which was later recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, when we came back and talked about Agent Orange, which the government denied until thousands of our brothers and sisters were already dead, now they recognize, we also learned about the atomic vets. The GIs who were used as human guinea pigs in the atomic testing to see how human beings could stand up to these sort of things. We also learned about the Gulf War syndrome. The government's back in a deny mode again, and they haven't shown any improvement from the Agent Orange to the Gulf War syndrome on how they're going to treat veterans. In the 25 years since the end of the Vietnam War, we have seen a steady decline in benefits and the way veterans are treated. And yet, today we're having books written by people who were not even alive at the time of the Vietnam War talking about perhaps it was a necessary war. Reevaluating it, saying it was part of the domino theory. I mean, time-tested and worn-out theories that have even been discredited by the people who practiced them at the time, like Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense during a couple of the administrations. They talk about how it was necessary to fight, acceptable casualty levels. It sounds to me like they're a bunch of young William Westmoreland clones or something, attempting to feed a new administration the same old bull. On the 25th anniversary of the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, Vietnam veterans' focus has not changed. Vietnam Veterans Against the War feels as strongly today as it does about U.S. military intervention, as strongly today as it feels about decent benefits for all veterans. We ask people to stop and think about the people who have died in these wars, to think about, if you want to talk about MIAs, talk about 500,000 or more MIAs in Vietnam. There's not a lot of big outcry or a lot of money being spent on the budget to find those, compared to our own MIAs, VOWs, who now number somewhere below 2,000. An incredible number when you look at how many people were in Vietnam, how many people died and were wounded in Vietnam on the American side. Such an incredibly low number, and the technology has moved so far forward that that number can be so low and yet be so high for the Vietnamese. No budget, no attempt, and no attempt at cleaning up the economic and social and ecological damage that was done to Vietnam. If we want a relationship with Vietnam, if we want to renew our ties with Vietnam, we have to start thinking about taking care of some of the humanitarian needs of that country also. 25 years after the war, Vietnam Veterans Against the War has been fighting for social justice and change and decent benefits for all veterans, and we will continue that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Our next speaker is Joan Davis. Joan is a school teacher and a former peace activist in Madison, and she'll be talking about the movement to end the war. Joan was demonstrating against the war while her future husband, Bill, from whom you just heard, was fighting in it. Joan.
I was both fortunate and I'm proud to be at Madison, Wisconsin from 1968 to 1974. I came to a campus that had already distinguished itself as one of the schools in the forefront of demonstrating against that war. One thing I want to dispel is that we were not a bunch of crazy hippies running around not knowing what we were doing. We were very clear on what we were doing during that struggle. We studied, we learned, we discussed, and we made a commitment to do whatever we could to help end that war in Vietnam. And something that we learned from that struggle is that people can affect change. We can dispel that notion that a lot of people have today, and sometimes, sadly, young people, that it's very difficult to challenge the government. On the other hand, we are seeing a little bit of that change as we see young people in Seattle and in Washington joining together and making powerful statements against the kind of policies that our government is involved in. I think I probably have a more important message, though, in terms of what it means to teach young people today. I'm a history teacher in high school, so I have the fortunate responsibility of making sure that my course doesn't end with World War II. We get through Vietnam, we spend a long time on it, and we bring people in who tell their stories. And I think that's an important message that I want to say today, is that the stories need to be told to young people. I have my students read books, and even after reading powerful books like Philip Caputo's Rumor of War, I still get them saying things like, but it sure did sound kind of exciting in combat. And I'm wondering what it takes to make sure young people understand the enormity of what it means to go and fight and kill as a young person, people that you have nothing against. And then I bring in the people to talk and tell their stories. And I think that's really what makes the difference. It finally gets through to young people that the war was wrong, that killing is wrong, and hopefully that war in general, not just in Vietnam, is wrong. One thing that they start asking then is their parents. Well, what were you doing then when your teacher was protesting? Or if there are people who don't have fathers that are vets, and many of my students do, they go back and ask, well, what were you doing while this protest was going on? Because they start thinking it's a really good idea to protest something that's immoral and unjust. And too often their parents will say, well, they didn't really know what was going on. I think one thing we have to make sure young people know is that you can't get away with that. That's not a cop-out anymore. We're not naive. It's not the early 60s where we think our government tells us the truth. We know our government lies. My students know the government lies, and I tell them that there's no excuse anymore to say, well, we just don't know. You've got to read the papers, you've got to learn about what's going on, and you've got to make a commitment to stand for truth and to stand for justice and dedicate some of your life for those changes, and I think young people are starting to think and do that.